how would you define clinical social work?
Well, I think what I love about clinical social work is that it's grounded in the foundation of generalist practice. And so we start out with this really solid core of what it means to be a generalist social worker.
Right.
I think what's unique about social work in general is we're always considering that social context.
Right.
So we don't just see the individual, and in fact, sometimes we can't even see the individual because of the social context being such a powerful driver.
Yeah.
So to me, that's first and foremost. And then also really building from a strength-based perspective, really a strong belief that people benefit from having their strengths and their resiliency identified versus taking a look at maybe deficits or
Right.
pathology.
Right.
I think that's one way that clinical social work is a little bit different, is that even though we have to be well aware of diagnostic and being able to do those assessments and understanding the bio, psycho, social, spiritual dimensions of the individuals that we're working with, that's just one component of who they are.
Right.
So in other words, we don't see their diagnosis or their pathology as the totality of their being, rather it just gives us some information about their level of functioning and the types of support that they need. So we have to have this clinical expertise in order to be able to work with them, but that's not where it ends.
Right, that's
and in
not
fact,
it.
that's kind of just one piece of many components. Certainly we carry over that strength-based perspective, and then also really understanding the context and how that context either enhances or inhibits the person's ability, the family's ability, the group's ability to function in whatever societal context they're living in. I think another big piece that I feel pretty passionate about is clinical social work tries to differentiate between social problems and individual pathology.
Right. Right.
So oftentimes what ends up happening, like an area of expertise for me, is high-risk kids and families involved in the juvenile justice system. And it's no secret that there's an overrepresentation of African-American youth, not only in the juvenile justice system, but also in the special education system, in particular with the EBD diagnosis. And we could look at that through the lens of, yeah, we have a lot of pathological conduct disordered kids, or we could take a step back and say, okay, why do we have such significant overrepresentation issues with this particular group? Why is there such disproportionality? And we have to understand all the factors that play into that, the long history of racism, oppression, marginalization, inability to access resources, how they're identified in these systems, kind of the points of contact and the resources that are available to them. Well, at the same time, you've got a kid and family in front of you that are needing services. So you want to target and deal with their mental health issues, deal with their trauma, their inability to function, while at the same time understanding those other contextual factors that lead into that. And that also helps the individual to not pathologize and perhaps normalize their experience while at the same time holding them accountable.
Right.
So it's this delicate balance between, providing support, providing accountability in the case with this population, while at the same time, looking at those larger systemic issues and problems.
So would you say this is one of the ways that social work is kind of unique in the clinical work that we do, is this ability to not only look at the individual functioning and maybe some of the struggles there, but the influence of the macro? And that's what maybe sets us, or what else might kind of make us different from other folks that work in mental health settings?
Right, I think that's a great question. I think most definitely our ability to understand that context is what sets us apart, along with our ability to remain strength-based.
Okay.
So in other words, if a kid is having difficulty functioning, and that might be behaviorally, but typically even under those behavioral challenges, there's some type of mental health, trauma, attachment issue, instead of pathologizing it, we kind of make sense of it.
Okay.
So it's like, yeah, this behavior would make sense based on this kid's history, instead of, oh my gosh, this kid is pathological and we have to diagnose them.
And maybe even looking at what is the positive of that and how have they really functioned well, even though it's something that also gets in their way.
Right, kind of
Okay.
how that is maybe even a form of resiliency.
Okay.
Or at the very least, normalizing.
Yeah.
Of course, based on these conditions, your behavior would make sense. Based on your background and the marginalization and the oppression that you've experienced and the trauma or whatever
Right. All of this together.
would make sense.
Yep.
So, and then also backing away from just the behavior and then understanding the systemic drivers that reinforce it. So not just being individually focused, but it's always those contextual factors that reinforce our behaviors, and then trying to make systemic changes, not only in the case of a child with their family, but also with that larger context with community and school and all of those systems that may be inadvertently reinforcing the very behaviors that we're trying to shift, change, and support.
So thinking again of that larger systems, even though the focus might be on the microsystem.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.